Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you to the Victorian branch of the Australian Institute for International Affairs. As Lawrence mentioned, I've been to, I think, virtually all of the branches of the Institute, from Perth to Adelaide to Brisbane to Canberra, Sydney, and now here. I have to say, probably the most enjoyable time I've had was at the Queensland branch, where Wayne Goss saw me speak on a couple of occasions. And for those of you who don't know, Wayne Goss, the former Premier of Queensland from 1989 to 1995, lost his battle with brain cancer today at the very young age of 63. And I thought I'd acknowledge him because he was a great supporter of the Australian Institute for International Affairs, particularly in Queensland. And good to see some old friends, Des, Jeremy. The other day, an old close friend of mine and a Liberal Party statesman of sorts quipped about my views on US foreign policy and Iraq and Ukraine by saying, "Tom, what's happened to you? You are to the left of Tanya Plibersek." Well, imagine my surprise.
That'd be difficult. Congratulations.
And I thought, what have I done to deserve this? And I'd just written an article in, of all places, the Guardian newspaper, making the point that the US air campaign strategy against the so-called Islamic State terrorists in Iraq was well-meaning, well-intended, but there was a danger it could make a bad situation worse. And that far from draining the swamps of Sunni jihadism, there is a danger it could replenish them. But the comment was that I was to the left of the Australian Labor Party, and I thought, imagine my surprise. I've often been labelled a man on the right. I'm actually quite proud to be associated with the Liberal Party over the years. My first and only bout at the Liberal Party pre-selection was in Bradfield. That's a blue ribbon seat in Sydney, which I narrowly lost in 2009. Paul Keating once said that I was a monkey who represented the jaundiced journalism that was part and parcel of the Howard years. And of course, over many years I've worked for a variety of centre-right and conservative and free market causes, such as the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, the Spectator magazine in Westminster, and of course the Australian and the Australian Financial Review. And as for my pro-American credentials, well, I was born in Dallas, Texas, and my father was a US Marine. He served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. As many of you know, a lot of the US servicemen spent time in Australia during the Vietnam War. One night in Sydney in the late 1970s, he was drunk at a pub, met a lady, a Sydney nurse. 9 months later, I was born. So as I tell my students, I will never criticise the US or Australian intervention in Vietnam, otherwise I would never have been born. So bear all this in mind when you hear my profoundly pessimistic take on the United States today. I am a great admirer of the United States, but I will be painting a fairly pessimistic portrait of the United States, and this goes across both political sides. Talking about ideological shifts, we all know that the political pendulum in America last week swung dramatically from the left. The Republicans picked up a good swath of House seats, which means that they have the largest Republican House majority in more than 80 years. They picked up anywhere between 7 and 9 Senate seats, which meant they can control the Senate for the first time in nearly a decade. And they won an astonishingly large amount of gubernatorial victories in die-hard Democratic states. States like Massachusetts, which of course was the only state in the Union in 1972 to vote against Richard Nixon. Maryland, which hardly has any Republican governors and senators over the last 40 years, they've elected a governor. And even Barack Obama's home state of Illinois, the Republicans picked up the governor's race there. Now, it is true, it was just a midterm where the incumbent's president's party usually gets a whack. You think of George W. Bush in 2006 or indeed Obama in 2010. And voter turnout was lower for a midterm election. But make no mistake, the midterm elections delivered a stinging rebuke to one man primarily, and that was Barack Obama. They were the equivalent in a parliamentary system of a vote of no confidence in the president. And I also believe they reflect what I've long called America's serious crisis of confidence. All the available public polling evidence, and I'll get to this in a few moments, indicates that the American people are in a profoundly foul mood. Large pluralities of Republicans and Democrats and independents think their country is heading in the wrong direction. Now, at one level, this is somewhat surprising because there's a lot of evidence to indicate that Americans should be upbeat. The unemployment level, after all, was about 10 going on 11% after the great global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, is now below 6%, so that's heading in the right trajectory. The federal budget deficit has shrunk to its lowest level as a share of the economy since 2007. And the economy could break the 3% annual growth rate for the first time in nearly a decade. And yet, President Obama's national approval ratings are in the low 40s, and in some, indeed many, battleground states last week, his approval ratings were in the low 30s. So unpopular is Obama that the president was largely absent from the recent congressional campaign trail. And moreover, Democrats themselves, many Democrats, were airing television commercials distancing themselves from President Obama's record. My favourite campaign commercial was for the Senate race in Kentucky. The Democrat candidate Alison Grimes, 35, very presentable, articulate. She ticked all the right boxes, but she had this spectre of Obama haunting her campaign. And so in one of these commercials, she got out a shotgun and championed guns' rights, and then she declared her love for big coal, saying that she would not support the president's attempts to decarbonise the economy. And time and again, when she was asked by journalists if she even voted for Barack Obama in 2012 or 2008, she refused to answer the question. So she became a bit of a laughingstock. So keen was she to distance herself from a very unpopular president. And remember, she was a Democrat. So where did it all go wrong? Why has the Obama phenomenon imploded with the force it has just 2 years since his impressive re-election? And I should declare that I was one of the few commentators who thought that Obama would lose in 2012, and I'm still wiping off the egg from my face. But nevertheless, he is deeply unpopular today. Let's explain why. First, Obama himself. There have been widespread and justified criticisms about the president's effectiveness and his general ability to lead, persuade and influence, both at home and abroad, when even his most senior former foreign policy advisors attack his record, as Bob Gates, Hillary Clinton, Leo Panetta have done in their memoirs in recent times, you know the president's prestige and credibility has dissipated dramatically. Writing in the recently released book called The Stranger, the Washington journalist Chuck Todd asked the question, how does one of the most successful politicians in American history appear to be so bad at practicing the basics of politics in the back rooms of Washington, whether on Capitol Hill, K Street, or the Pentagon? How could someone so intellectually advanced be so politically stunted? That's the question that Chuck Todd asks. Todd is the host of NBC's Meet the Press, which would be the equivalent of the ABC's Insiders program on Sunday mornings. And for Todd, it's Obama's arrogance got the better of him. According to Todd, Obama's happy experience as editor of the Harvard Law Review, when he was in his late teens, early 20s, gave him a false sense of self-confidence that burns in him and burns him to this day. Yet, Chuck goes on, where his cockiness ends, an overabundance of caution takes over. especially true when dealing with issues like guns, gays, or race that might offend working class voters. Now, mind you, Obama himself alone is not purely responsible for what The Economist magazine called the midterm massacre. There's also a widespread sense of economic angst in the United States, despite the fact that unemployment's coming down, the deficit's coming down, growth rates are starting to pick up. There's a widespread sense of economic angst. Low paid and part-time work, they're the new jobs. These are the so-called MIC jobs, and they don't make people feel really better off. The recent recovery has been the most sluggish in generations. You think about the recoveries after the early 80s recession and the early 90s recession. That is the Reagan recoveries or the Clinton recoveries. They averaged about 5% annual growth for the first 4 years after the end of the recession. The Obama recovery is only 2%, if that. Big difference in recoveries between Obama on the one hand and the Clinton-Reagan recoveries on the other. And this is interesting. In the Obama era, inequality has widened dramatically, and median household income has declined by 4.4% since 2009. It's extraordinary. Median household income has declined by 4.4% in the Obama era. And of course, unlike the Bush era, there is no easy credit from the Federal Reserve or a housing boom to make up the difference. Add to this the botched rollout of the controversial healthcare reforms, the rise of the Islamic State terrorists in Iraq, which Obama had declared a foreign policy success for his administration when he withdrew US troops in 2011. And of course, the inviting of this Ebola virus in America. That's really made people uneasy, and Americans are in no mood to re-elect incumbent politicians. And as it happens, more Democrat senators were up for re-election than Republicans, and most of the competitive races were in Republican-leaning states. And so that meant that the Democrats were always going to struggle this year. Now, none of this should downplay the impressive victory by the Republicans last week. Time and again throughout the last few years, they've been written off as a bunch of kooks and cranks dominated by the so-called Tea Party. But they deserve success. They deserve their success, I believe, for two main reasons. First, the Republicans avoided the mistakes that have plagued them in the recent past. For one thing, the party chose more sensible and mainstream candidates whom the Democrats could not portray as extremists. You may recall this happened in a variety of US states in the midterm elections in 2010. Nevada, Delaware, among other states where Tea Party candidates were running for the Republican ticket instead of more establishment conservatives. You may recall in 2010, the Republican candidate in Delaware, a lady named Christine O'Donnell, who in her television commercial declared, "I am not a witch." And she of course felt the need to say these words after it was revealed that she once dabbled with witchcraft. The denial of course was somewhat undermined by her all-black outfit and the smoky background. But the point here is that the Senate seats in 2010 and the 2012, which the Republicans should have won, they were hurt by these inexperienced, some might say, wacky candidates. This time, of course, the Republican Party, as the distinguished syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer pointed out, exercise adult supervision over the choice of candidates. So, as I say, it's very difficult for the Democrats to portray them as extremists. The other reason why the Republicans did so well is that voters have not been going to the polls with fresh memories of the government shutdown and the bitter intra-party divisions that the shutdown provoked a year ago. You've often heard Harold Macmillan's quip that a week is a long time in politics. Well, a year is an eternity, and so a lot of Americans have forgotten about the tremors and the misfortune and the unhappiness over the government shutdown a year ago, which polls show blame the Republicans more than the administration. So, with so many key races in Republican states, an unpopular president, and more at stake for the Republicans, the Democrats were expecting to lose the Senate. but they did not have as much to lose as the Republicans, who had the political winds behind their backs. I think one should also bear in mind that however successful the Republicans were last week, in many respects their brand has been damaged in recent times by both the Bush administration and by both the Tea Partiers. Like American conservatism itself, and in many respects it pains me to say this, as I worked at the American Enterprise Institute for many years in the mid-1990s and still have very good friends there, I think it's fair to say that American conservatism, like the Republican Party, lacks a national leader. There are no Reagans in today's Republican Party. It's riven by factionalism and disputes, and it displays at some levels a lack of intellectual self-consciousness and philosophical reflection. Although the Republicans spent heavily and deployed new technology to help sell a get out the vote effort, they have hardly ridden the kind of wave that lifted the party in 1994 when the Republicans took both houses of Congress. I think that's an important point to bear in mind. The main source of Republican unity in recent times has been one person, and that's Barack Obama, and what many Republicans, I believe, rightly think is an interventionist and a big spending agenda. The post-Obama era may not be so bright for Republicans. In the post-Obama era, the conservative movement, whose base, let's not forget, is whiter and older than the new America, there is a danger it could disintegrate into different factions. You've got the Tea Partiers, you've got the establishment conservatives, you've got non-interventionists versus the neo-conservatives. There is a great debate taking place right now about the future direction of the Republican Party in the next 2 years in the lead up to the 2016 presidential race. It's widely believed that history and demography are on the Democrats' side. Talk about three main coalitions: women, minorities, and young people. You may recall they swept Obama into power in both 2008 and 2012, and it's widely believed to be an enduring reality of the new era. In 2014, African Americans, Latinos, students, single women, and other Democratic constituencies did not turn up to the polls, whereas they did in 2012. And they didn't turn up in the polls in the kind of numbers they do in those national elections. And if the Democratic machine marshals the get-out vote game, which played so well in other national elections, the Democrats' future looks bright. I think it's also fair to say that Americans are becoming more progressive on some social issues. I don't think Obama himself is primarily responsible for the shift, but he's nevertheless presided over some dramatically changing attitudes on, say, same-sex marriage. The nation has become more progressive. In 2004, Gallup, the most authoritative public opinion organisation, showed that opposition to gay marriage was 60%, and only 30% supported gay marriage. Today, 10 years later, those numbers have basically been reversed. It's a dramatic sea change in such a short period of time. And to the extent that these trends continue, it does hurt the Republican Party, which of course has a very strong Christian conservative constituency. Just to make this point, as recently as 2011, Barack Obama opposed gay marriage. In 2012, during the election, he supported gay marriage, and his support did not hurt him one jot in those battleground states. That November, in 2012, voters adopted a same-sex marriage initiative in as many as 4 states. This was after 32 defeats at the ballot box on the same issue. Now, I mentioned earlier, it's amazing that the United States is regarded as a centre-right country, very strong conservative Christian social base in many respects. But I mentioned earlier that on Iraq, my Liberal friends think that I am to the left of Tanya Plibersek. Well, on gay marriage, think about this. Julia Gillard is to the right of Dick Cheney. Extraordinary, isn't it? So we've got a dilemma here. If neither Obama and the Democrats on the one hand, or the Republicans on the other, fully explain the midterm massacre, as The Economist put it, what is the explanation? What accounts for this, the results of last week's elections. I believe, and I've been a pub bore on this question for several years, but I think the most plausible explanation for the rapid electoral mood swings in the United States, epitomised in Obama's fall from adulation to contempt, has to do with what I've called a serious crisis of confidence. It's a cultural malaise that precedes the Obama presidency. Let me put this in some broader historical context. For generations, Americans of all ideological stripes have rightly believed that the United States is the most powerful, the most prosperous, culturally and economically the most influential nation in the world. For generations, Americans have seen their nation as a city upon a hill, John Winthrop, the last best hope of earth, Abraham Lincoln, that would make the world safe for democracy, Woodrow Wilson. This same vision is echoed in the idea of the American century, which shaped the national consciousness after World War II, when the US enjoyed an almost absolute supremacy in world affairs and virtually single-handedly helped rebuild Western Europe and East Asia from the ravages of fascism. The collapse of Soviet communism and the end of the Cold War, precisely a quarter of a century ago, as well as the long boom of the 1990s, I think reinforced the perception of American exceptionalism. This notion that America is born of an idea, dedicated to a manifest destiny, and is committed to a benign global preeminence. I believe, and this is a minority view among conservatives and liberals in America, but I believe, commentators at least, the American people are slowly and painfully coming to grips with the reality that those days are over. In recent times, the United States has experienced a period of upheaval, a sluggish growth, a debt larger than GNP, alarming deficits, diminished net wealth, subprime mortgage crisis, downgraded credit rating, crumbling infrastructure, a rise in China and a declining US unipolarity, and a polarised and dysfunctional political system beholden to special interests, and of course both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which hurt American credibility and prestige, not to mention blood and treasure. It's at this point you probably think a bit like Basil Fawlty in that episode of Fawlty Towers, when the hotel inspector reads out that long list of complaints about what's wrong with the hotel. There's 2 dead pigeons in the water tank, the stove's not working, blah, 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 blah. And Basil Fawlty replies, "Otherwise okay?" But this is the point. For Americans of different political and ideological persuasions, otherwise okay is not good enough, because America is widely perceived as an exceptional nation. It's different from the rest of the world. And for many of these Americans, and this notion of American exceptionalism, however jarring it is for non-Americans, it's as apple as American pie. Losing global preeminence means losing the country they know and love. It was not George W. Bush, but the Democrat former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright who declared, quote, "We are the indispensable nation, we stand tall and we see further than other countries into the future." And it was not Bush's deputy, Dick Cheney, but the former President Secretary of State, and probably at this stage the odds-on favourite to be the Democrat candidate for 2016, Hillary Clinton, who argued, "Americans have always risen to the challenges we have faced. It is in our DNA. We do believe there are no limits on what is possible or what can be achieved." Yet again, returning to my pub bore theme, I think history has left American exceptionalism behind. The world is slowly but surely moving beyond the capacity of any one state to shape the global agenda. Moreover, the nation is badly off track, and there is a hemorrhage of confidence in America's future. All the available public polling evidence, as I alluded to earlier, shows that Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Liberals, Conservatives, Centrists think their country is heading in the wrong direction. Sometimes it's 65 to 70, sometimes it's as high as late 80s. And that's been the case now for the best part of a decade. According to a recent Washington Post ABC News poll, 2/3 of the American people say that neither the President nor the Congress has a clear plan for governing. Remember, Obama took office during 2 wars and a global financial crisis, but he has comprehensively failed to meet the expectations of all the hope and change that his campaigns represented. There is a widespread sense that Washington has become more dysfunctional than in the past. And the causes are deep-seated, and they're more deep-seated than any one president or political party. A more polarising political culture, an unprecedented amount of money spent on campaigns, and this relentless 24/7 news, cable news, talk radio, this social media environment that helped culminate in the government shutdown a year ago. According to the distinguished New York Times analyst Peter Baker, since Obama's first year in office in 2009, all the Gallup polling evidence shows that, quote, public confidence in virtually every major institution of American life has fallen. Think of the military, the courts, Congress, public schools, organised religion, the criminal justice system, print, digital media, broadcasting, and so on. Now, to be sure, of course, America has enormous demonstrated capacity for change and renewal. Demographic trends work to its advantage. It has moderately high immigration and fertility levels, whereas its major geopolitical competitor, China, as we all know, will grow old before it grows rich. The US is also on the cusp of being energy independent. I'm no authority on fracking or the shale gas revolution, but the widespread consensus among economists is that these developments mean that America is more than likely going to be energy independent. And remember, every president since Nixon at the time of the OPEC oil crisis has yearned for America to be energy independent. And to the extent that America is energy independent, that would have huge implications for America's role in the world, particularly the Middle East. And I think one should always remember history. Every time the critics give America the kiss of death, it's mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. She revives and bounces back with tremendous force. You think of the Civil War in the 1860s, the Great Depression, Pearl Harbor, Vietnam, Watergate. America has enormous demonstrated capacity for change and renewal. But one can appreciate the resilience of American society and still concede something is terribly wrong with the United States today. Indeed, that famous ability to rebound from adversity will be put to a severe test in the coming decade. The danger of American exceptionalism is that it discourages compromise and encourages omnipotence. And yet clearly the US will never again enjoy the kind of absolute global supremacy that it held in the decades following World War II. Indeed, there's good reason to think we're entering what the distinguished US commentator Fareed Zakaria has called his award-winning book, The Post-American World. And if the next president fails to lower expectations, there's a danger that Americans will express more doubts and frustrations and outrage. But as creatures of their culture, Americans will find it hard to contemplate any notion of decline, however mild and structural. After all, it would mean a rejection of their national identity. This is the background against which the midterm elections were being fought, and the anger and anxieties of the nation explain why neither major party is connecting with the thoughts and attitudes of Middle America. Perhaps Henry Kissinger's joke about the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s reflects the American people's attitudes about politics today. That is, quote, it's a pity both sides can't lose. None of this means that, necessarily means that Obama will go from a lame duck to a dead duck. He's got 2 years left in his presidency and he wants to leave having accomplished some major legislative groundbreaking policies. Some issues do indeed demand bipartisan support: corporate sector reform, infrastructure, and there is the issue, of course, of immense importance for Australians. And I'm thinking of trade in East Asia. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was flagged by President Obama in Hawaii at APEC en route to Canberra in late 2011. It's a 12-nation, multinational, regional free trade deal that's being proposed by the Americans. Australia and New Zealand are part of the TPP, but not the Chinese. And one of the reasons why it's been slow, progress has been slow, is because it's been legislative limbo in Washington. The Democrats, the president's own party, who are tied to environmentalists, labour unions, have refused to give their own president a trade promotion authority, otherwise known as fast track, so that he can have a free hand to negotiate a free trade deal in East Asia. It's the Republicans, whose hand has been strengthened on Capitol Hill because they're more free trade oriented, are more than likely going to give the president a free hand to negotiate a trade deal without all of those labour and environmental conditions that the Democrats would attach to it. I think that's a key point, and I suspect that will be a big issue in the coming months, the TPP, and that will be a sign of bipartisanship in Washington. So there are grounds for optimism at the legislative level over the next 2 years. But I get back to my crux of the matter here this evening. For the most part, I do believe that the American people are in a foul mood, and there is really little evidence to suggest that happy days will return anytime soon. Now, to the extent that such attitudes prevail, that frustration, that level of doubts, confidence, lack of confidence, will continue to roil American politics for many years to come. And I'll leave you with this. I think perhaps Tony Abbott might have had it right 2 years ago when he addressed the Washington-based Heritage Foundation and said, "America needs to believe in itself the way that others still believe in it." And I would add, until it does, expect more electoral volatility in the American political system. Thank you very much.